What does the future hold for this place? Trepassey, Newfoundland and Labrador is a beautiful town, and it holds a special place in my heart. I had some friends from Trepassey in high school, like the early part of high school. Leslie Devereaux, Melissa Peno, Candace Manuel. I tried calling you out in videos in the past, but I know there's a good chance those videos never reached you, and there's a good chance you don't even remember me. That was all a long time ago now. I met Leslie, Melissa, and Candace through basketball. Should be no surprise to anyone who knows me or to anyone who already knows anything about basketball in Newfoundland, really. The Newfoundland basketball history books, if any exist, must be full up with names of the great players and teams from the town of Trepassey. When I was in junior high and high school, I used to go down to Munn with my dad and my brothers on Saturday nights and sometimes on Sunday afternoons for the double-header basketball games. The women's game usually first, followed by the men's game. This wasn't the field house, it was before that was built. The old gym would fill up to the rafters with fans, and the atmosphere was a lot of fun. Some of the best players on both the men's and women's teams at Munn, the Seahawks, in those days, were from Trepassey, and those teams were pretty good. If memory serves, the women even won the Atlantic Division at least once in the mid-90s. I mentioned the name Devereaux earlier. That Devereaux name pops back up here again with John and Jennifer. Both played starring roles on their respective teams. No surprises here, really. What was a little bit surprising in my grade 12 year was when my competitive but not great O'Donnell High team from Mount Pearl was getting stomped by the likes of Brother Rice and Holy Heart of Mary. But it was actually Stella Maris from Trepassey that steamrolled their way through those teams en route to a provincial 4A championship that year. This was kind of amazing when you consider that schools like O'Donnell and Holy Heart had as many as, or maybe even more, students as the town of Trepassey had residents. And this was before the bottom fell out of her. This was 1997. By this point in time, a lot of folks already started moving out of Trepassey. The town had already lost a good portion of its population, but still stood at a little over 1,000 residents. A few years before, in 1991, the main employer in town shut down, throwing around 600 people out of work, and that's when things really started to change. Of course, it was a fish processing plant that served as the main employer for the region, and Trepassey was basically the hub of the southern Avalon. This was actually one of a few fishing hubs on the island that, in 1991, acted as a bellwether for what was on the horizon. But unlike Grand Bank over on the Burin Peninsula, who also struggled in a big way when its fish plant shut down in 1991, the one in Trepassey never had the good fortune of a buyer coming in and restarting the operation. When just about every other fish plant in Newfoundland shut down 1 year later, when the cod moratorium was implemented on July 2nd, 1992, Trepassey was kicked hard when it was already down. For every Grand Bank, there's a Trepassey. For every Harbour Breton, there's a Galtas. And I feel like I owe it to you to share stories about the places in Newfoundland that are struggling alongside the stories of towns that are thriving in order to give you the whole story, the complete picture. It gives me great pleasure to talk about how places in Newfoundland like Bonavista or Twillingate or Fogo Island have reinvented themselves in the face of dire uncertainty after the fishery collapsed. Trepassey has every bit of potential to do something special in the same way that these other Newfoundland communities have done. But it was always a much smaller town than either of those ones, and I feel like the blow that this community took in 1991 before that knockout punch was delivered in the following year just makes it that much harder to pivot. Today, the town's population is estimated at just 400 people. According to a CBC story from about 3 years ago, There were just 26 students in the K-12 school, and that's a student population that must also include children from the neighboring towns like St. Shots and Portugal Cove South. I have to think there are even fewer students today, but I don't know. It's hard to imagine how things can turn around here, but there's always hope. Newfoundland as a whole was not given much of a chance to get off the ropes in the early 2000s. After the dust settled and the devastation of a few years under the moratorium was laid bare for all to see, the province as a whole has outperformed in every single projection in just about every statistical category from those days. It's no utopia these days, and I'm not pretending that it is, but Stephen Nolan wrote a book back in 2007 called Leaving Newfoundland that a lot of Newfoundlanders may be familiar with. And he ended the preface of the book with a line that said, "Remember, if you're the last one out, please turn off all the lights." That was the future we were promised. The population of the province has rebounded today to within shouting distance of the peak population 1991 number. Today it stands at around 545,000 people. The peak was about 580,000. Some projections from as late as 2001 that I am aware of foresaw the population of Newfoundland and Labrador shrinking to well below 500,000 by now. Trepassey isn't going down without a fight. This is a town that took the devastation of the moratorium head on like a hurricane blowing in from the Grand Banks, but there's real hope here. Hope supported by evidence, at least anecdotal evidence. I know personally of a couple of people who have either purchased property in Trepassey or who have their sights set on doing so soon. Peter S., friend of the channel. I miss you, my YouTube friend. I hope you're doing better now after Hurricane Helene kept you and your wife in North Carolina last year, and I hope you make your way back to Trepassey soon, if you can. There are points of interest and major attractions, like being the halfway point along the majestic Irish Loop. There is the nearby Cape Race site with the beautiful lighthouse that I talked about in my last video, and the UNESCO World Heritage site known as Mistaken Point Ecological Reserve. You have the raw beauty of the town itself, and neighboring towns, as I mentioned, like St. Shots and Portugal Cove South. And then you have the beaches of St. Stephen's and St. Vincent's just a little further up the loop, where whales love to hang out in the spring and early summer. You have the edge of the Avalon Inn and restaurant right there in town. I came through town this past July super early in the morning, so they weren't open while I was in town, but I ate there once back in 2022, and it was deadly. And I can personally vouch for the claim they make here on this sign. There are other signs that the tourism economy is trying to get a foothold in town. And this isn't something that just happens. There are people behind these efforts. John Devereaux, the former Munn Seahawk star I mentioned earlier, is one example of one person, along with his family, working hard to push Trepassey forward. Larry Critch, as I discovered, was another. Tourism may or may not be the ultimate savior for every single town on the island of Newfoundland, but since it looks like the fish won't be coming back to be processed in Trepassey anytime soon, tourism is as good a place as any to focus on, since the place has so many things going for it in this regard already. Back in the first few years of the new millennium, not many quote-unquote experts gave Newfoundland much of a chance to rebound from the devastation of the Northern Cod moratorium. Time after time, the province itself, but more specifically towns like Bonavista and Twillingate, surprised everyone by finding their way to prosperity. Not always like a transcendent prosperity, but compared to the alternative, a pretty solid place where one can envision a future at the very least. Trepassey missed that first wave of change that swept through Newfoundland. 3/4 of the population of the town of Trepassey left, which included a huge percentage of the young people of the town. But there are signs that maybe there is still a heartbeat here. Signs that there is a future for this town on the southern tip of Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula.